Hey guys, in this video I'll be reviewing The Hobbit, which is obviously a very famous book and very famous series of movies, although the quality of the book and the movies is famously different. But anyway, so yeah, to quickly dive in, this video will have lots of spoilers and, basically go read The Hobbit, essentially. The spoiler-free section of this review is go read The Hobbit. But yes, there's lots of spoilers, but we'll just have a little chat about the book. So first of all, this book is very, the first kind of thing to discuss is how it compares to Lord of the Rings, because that's how a lot of people will kind of know The Hobbit, right? Few people will know about The Hobbit and not know about Lord of the Rings, right? So, The Hobbit is it's much, much smaller than Lord of the Rings. Like, I can't get that across enough. It's like a few hundred pages long, whereas Lord of the Rings is a proper 1,200-page epic, So it's a much shorter book, and it's a much more narrow book. It's got a much more narrow scope. Although, funnily enough, they kind of play out in a similar way, and like the overall plot of both is kind of the same, where it's like we have a quest fantasy, we need to go from X place to Y place in order to achieve our, goal, right? So, you've all seen Lord of the Rings or read Lord of the Rings, you've got to go destroy the ring, right? Whereas in a Hobbit, we've got to go get the gold from a dragon. But it's kind of the same basic premise. But of course, The Hobbit is much, much shorter. And it's also much more easily written. What's the word I'm looking for? Like, the prose is much lighter. So if you read Lord of the Rings, or have tried to read Lord of the Rings, you will notice that the prose is very dense. And not only is it dense, but there's just a lot of it. As in, there's just a lot of stuff, there's, like, long descriptions and long everything. There's Tom Bombadil, if you've read Lord of the Rings, there's all these things that take a long time, right? And The Hobbit has none of that. The Hobbit is very quick, very pacey, very fast-paced, and very, very easy prose. He's not trying to, and of course, he's not trying to bamboozle you with his, beautiful poetry. With that said, though, I will admit that there is a fair few songs in The Hobbit, just like Lord of the Rings, but you can employ the strategy I used when reading Lord of the Rings, which is that you read the first sentence of the song and the last sentence of the song. You kind of get the gist of what's going on and you move on. But of course, if you like Tolkien songs, I'm not sure who you are if you do, but if you do like them, then you're obviously more than welcome to read them. But so that's kind of a comparison to Lord of the Rings, where The Hobbit is much shorter, much more punchy. In terms of quality, I would honestly say it's on a similar level. Like, they're both very enjoyable books, and they both have that real Tolkienian world building, and you do get that nice world building that we like from Middle-earth in The Hobbit, and we get the characters are kind of the same as well. No, that's not to say that they're the same characters, but what I'm saying is the way they're presented is kind of the same, where they're very, like, everybody is basically, what's the word? Like, this is going to sound negative the way I'm about to say it, but everyone's not super deep as a character. But that's kind of okay, because they're kind of almost representing like an archetype, I guess, if that makes sense. Like, Gandalf is, and to be fair, it's not really Tolkien's fault that his characters come off in this kind of generic way, because people have taken his characters and just copied them, right? So it's not his fault, right? Like, it's not his fault there's always a wise wizard character in every fantasy book now, like Gandalf. And it's not his fault that there's, dwarves that like to mine in every fantasy book now, but because that's probably inspired by him, you know what I'm saying? But yeah, so that's just kind of an unfortunate consequence of Tolkien being as influential as he is. But yeah, so the books are just like, I guess the overall comparison between Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit is that they play out very similar in terms of, you get the nice world building, you have a similar quest fantasy style, but The Hobbit is much easier to read, much shorter, and like, you can literally read in an afternoon. You could get the book down at 3 o'clock and, have a nice dinner and a cup of tea and read it until 12 and you'd be done. You know what I mean? So that's, whereas Lord of the Rings, if you tried to do that, you'd be, you would not succeed. You would not succeed at all. So that's kind of it for the comparison to Lord of the Rings, but how does it stack up in its own right? So, The Hobbit, like I said, is this basic quest fantasy. Of course, it's a little interesting because we're never told exactly, like, I think, and perhaps one of the weaknesses of The Hobbit is we're never told exactly what their plan is, right? They're like, okay, we're going to go to a mountain, we're going to get the gold, we're going to burgle some gold. And so it's not quite as cool because, say that it was set up as in we're going to go and kill the dragon, right? Then, it's got some stakes to it, whereas we're just going to go burgle some gold feels a little bit of like a smaller stakes, you know what I'm saying? With that said, though, it's still very fun. You kind of know, where it's for most of the book before they get to the mountain, it's very much like, we're going from here to here, and it makes you feel that real sense of progression, because, you get closer and closer, and Bilbo's like, well, are we near the mountain yet? And everyone's like, no, bro, we're near the mountain. And then, he sees mountain on the horizon, and there's all these things, so you have this very obvious sense of progression, which is literally just progression through distance, so it really helps you feel like the story is moving somewhere, which of course it is, right, which is what we like. In terms of world building, like I said, when I was comparing it to Lord of the Rings, the world building is very, very strong. We get lots of cool, cool different races. We've got our dwarves and our elves, and then our hobbits as well, and then of course men, and then we have Gandalf, who is, if you want to go full Silmarillion, is like a Maiar, I think. Yes, Maiar? Yep. But anyway, so, we've got that cool world building. We see lots of the world, because obviously they're traveling through it. And then I guess just to break down, like, there's some of the really cool scenes that we know, or that, like, I guess in, that like people are aware of. Like, for example, we get the cool troll scene, where the trolls are trying to eat them and then they get turned to stone, which is actually referenced in Lord of the Rings, both the book and the movie. So that's really strong. And we get, the cool, obviously the riddles in the dark scene, which is, where Bilbo gets the ring off Gollum. It's a really strong scene. It's strong in the movies actually as well, the Hobbit movies, which we'll get to that later. And it's strong in the book. So there's these cool scenes that we get to, and it's fun to see Bilbo kind of navigate through these, through these different like challenges and kind of grow over the story. It's a very typical hero's journey. Like he goes away and then he comes back, a different changed guy and a better person perhaps, and a more wealthy person. But it works. And so that's why people keep doing the hero's journey, because the hero's journey works. So yeah, but I will say that it can sort of feel a bit like, if we want to criticize it a little bit, it can feel a bit lacking in I guess maybe the word is nuance, like. Because, when you read modern fantasy and you really get, and they're like, there's like 12 political factions that are all fighting, and, like, everyone's kind of bad and everyone's kind of good, and, like, for example, if you read First Law, right, like, there's so much nuance in that series, there's so much different stuff going on, so many different kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? There's so many different, like, motivations, and everyone's got like 12 different motivations, and there's very many layers, whereas The Hobbit is quite simple. But with that said, I mean, what that does mean is that it scratches a different itch, because you're kind of just like, oh, I want a chill story, nothing, I don't need to be challenged too hard, particularly, and it's also good in that way for kids, right? You've got like, I would say maybe like 8 to 12 sort of year old kid who was like, oh, I kind of want to read a bit of fantasy. I might chuck The Hobbit at them before I would chuck First Law or like Song of Ice and Fire or anything, you know what I'm saying? And certainly before I chuck Lord of the Rings at them. So it does kind of have a strength in that way, where it's it appeals to that younger demographic, which is of course who he wrote it for originally, I do believe. So if you want to judge on authorial intent, then he kind of hit his target there. Just trying to think if there's anything else I want to say. Oh yeah, shall we compare it to the movies a little bit? So first of all, what you got to understand is that the movies, I'm sure you do understand this if you've seen them, the movies are not great, right? But they're not great because of Hollywood and like studio fuckery, rather than because the Hobbit books are bad or difficult to adapt. Because in fact, I think the Hobbit would actually be a very easy book to adapt into a movie, really. But of course, there's just a lot of extending and putting in random stuff. And it's unfortunate because they add a lot of extra conflict, which is not necessary, because The Hobbit kind of has a little bit of conflict in itself, and like I said, it has that strong sense of progression through the quest. But in the movies, they add in, for example, Azog in the book, you just kind of hear about him, he's just like, oh yeah, that Azog guy. Whereas in the movie, he's like a central antagonist, it's real scary, and, kind of takes up like half a bloody screen time. And then, of course, the problem is the movie as well, it kind of ruins some of these, what I think were actually really cool scenes. For example, the scene where, they go into the mountain, and then, like, Smaug is there, and then he flies off, and they're like, and then there's all this confusion, and they're like, oh my god, like, what are we going to do about this giant dragon? He's actually here, and then he flies away. Whereas in the movie, they just horribly butcher that with this, like, terrible scenes of, like, fighting the dragon with, like, molten gold and stuff, and then they're, like, somehow expecting that to work against him, even though he literally breathes fire. Like, it's just bad. It's really bad. And then, of course, in the movie, you also have, them butchering, because in the book we have this really cool scene, where they go into the Goblin Cave, and they kind of escape through, like, Gandalf helping and through their wits and through, like, superior, they fight their way out, they earn it, you know what I mean? I guess that's what I'm saying. And so, and you have this, it's a cool scene, and then they get split from Bilbo, and we get our nice, Riddles in the Dark thing as well. Whereas in the movie, it's just cartoonish and, like, terrible. They don't really earn their escape. I mean, if it was, if real physics was applied, they would have died, like, they would have died, like, 10 times, like, horribly, through, like, severe blunt force trauma. And, and they kind of cartoonify everything, like the big goblin, they kind of make him, like a laughing stock. And to be fair, I will agree that, I had a little bit of a giggle, but he's, like, from the movie Great Goblin, but it just kind of really undercuts everything. It's just super cartoonish, And I kind of want to get that across through this review, which is that the Hobbit book, whilst it might be, perhaps designed for a younger audience and much more relaxed than Lord of the Rings, it is definitely not cartoonish or silly, you know what I mean? It takes itself seriously, not like ridiculously seriously, it's not grim dark or anything, but it's not like the movies are, where everything is like super dumbed down and, there's like crazy stupid physics and nothing makes a lot of sense and it's like super long. The Hobbit is kind of so I guess to finish off, to conclude this review, The Hobbit is a short, kind of punchy version of Lord of the Rings, perhaps targeted at a younger audience. It's compared to modern fantasy, it's kind of more simple and more approachable, with less nuance, but because of that, it kind of has its own attraction, and it's not like the movies. It takes itself seriously and it like respects itself, So yeah, so I guess that's my review. I hope you enjoyed.